Okay, welcome to class this afternoon. We're going to take a look at the skull, the bones of the skull. This is the first part of the skeletal system review that we're going to go through. And a little bit about that for you. There are 206 bones in the human body. There's probably an equal number of openings and structures and processes and flat areas and ridges and grooves and holes that you need to learn too. And this is one of the things that we do in lab that has real practical applications for you later on. And knowing the bones and learning them, and so that you won't forget them later on, is very helpful, whether you're going into radiography or nursing or surg tech or physical therapy. It doesn't matter. You know, it's important to know these structures. And the way we have it set up for you is to give you plenty of time to prepare for learning these bones. And I want to take you over and show you I want to go into eLearn, and I'll have to open it up the other way. Let me close, let me get out of here. One second, I'm going to show you what's in eLearn. Now I'm going to go back here. See if this will show up for me now. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, this is the eLearn content for this lab. And we go over here to course information and click on content. It'll come up here, and we go to Unit 2, Bones of the Skeleton. And we have the skull and the axial skeleton right here. And we click here. We have, first of all, the master bone list. Now, there is no study guide for this test, because the master bone list is essentially it, because this lists every bone, every opening, every joint, every articulation that we can possibly think of that would be that you need to know. And there's probably more than you ever wanted to know, but they're here and they're available. You know, it's a good place to review. Get this out of the way here, because it has all 206 bones plus all the articulations. Where articulations are where bones come together, plus all the openings in the bones, plus the processes, the bulges on the bones that go up and down or side to side, the flat areas, the irregular areas, and things like that. So it's the master list. You'll also have the PowerPoint file and the PDF file here and here for the skull. Here is a 14-minute video. I made a very short review of the skull. You can go through. The axial skeleton has its PowerPoints and PDF file. The axial skeleton is the vertical axis, so it'd be the vertebrae, the ribs, the sternum here that articulate with the skull. And then the last category is the appendicular skeleton, that all the appendages, the arms and legs, fingers and toes, hands and feet. There's a review here on this on, I didn't want to go into that. There's also a 14-minute, 10-minute video on the axial skeleton you can watch too. Now, then in the next section, we have here the appendicular skeleton with a short video on that, plus the PowerPoints. And then below that, we have joints and articulations, which are just the PowerPoints. So we're going to go through all of these over the next several weeks. And let me get back up here to skull and axial skeleton. So what we're going to do today is go over the skull, and there are 22 bones, and there's about that many various openings, maybe more openings and ridges and grooves and stuff like that. And I want to point them out to you, and we're going to talk about them. And the way you prepare for this test is not to wait till the week of the exam and then study like crazy for one day and then take it. Since there's so much material, the easiest way to prepare for this test is to learn a little bit every day. I know you're going to take your lab test 1 sometime in the next 10 days, but you could take 15 minutes out of that preparing for that test and learn 5 bones of the skull. And then the next day, learn a 6th bone and a 7th bone and an 8th bone. And pretty soon, after a week or so, you've got everything in the skull committed to memory because you go over it every day. And then go to the axial skeleton, which we'll cover next week. And then after that, go to the appendicular skeleton. See, the nice thing about the appendicular skeleton in particular is that everything on the left side of the body is exactly the same as on the right side. So there's no difference here. The bones of the arm and the upper arm and the forearm are exactly the same on both sides. Same with the legs, same with the pelvic girdle, same with the shoulder girdle. They're all the same. If you learn one arm, you got the other arm learned. And in a week or so, I'll tell you about, if you can find your thumb, all the things that your thumb will tell you about everything in your arm. So anyway, so this is where it's going to come from. You have your master bone list. Let me just bring it up and show you what it looks like. It has all the bones. I think I start with the skull, with the frontal bone, and I go down here and I move into the arms somewhere. No, still in the skull here. Yeah. So there's so it looks like we have about 50 things to know here. This is taken right from the study, the AP1 Lab Manual, which is essentially embedded in your e-learn content. So if you go through here and just start picking things to study as we go through them, follow along here. But this is where all your bone list is. So, and that is essentially your study guide too. So, okay, I'm going to get out of this and go back to the PowerPoint. So stop sharing for a second, and then try it again, and here we go with the skull. Okay. Any questions on this? Any questions about what I've shown you so far? I mean, I know it's a lot. That's why there's a great deal of time between now and the exam, because it takes a while to master this material, but it will be helpful. It'll be the kind of thing that you won't forget. And when we go into the next unit in lab on muscles become really easy because if you've learned the bones, because a lot of the muscles have the same name or some variation on the same name as the bone that it sits on top of or attaches to. So that makes life a whole lot easier in learning the muscles. Plus, there's only 60 muscles, not 206. Okay, let's move on. So the skull. Now, this little cartoon here doesn't do anything, but what it does remind you, and it always reminds me, not that I need to, I don't get out much. So if you look at it, it has a fair number of the bones listed there in the arms, particularly in the appendicular skeleton, and the arms and legs and fingers and toes. And it's always a good reminder that everything in the left-hand side on the appendicular skeleton is the same as the right-hand side. There's no difference. And also on ribs. Ribs are ribs. Doesn't matter. There's only 12 pairs of ribs. They're all ribs. There's the first 7, the next 3, and the last 2. the bones of the skull, you could argue that a lot of, that they're the same on both sides there. Where they have two separate sides, it's the same on both sides. So while it's this sort of, juvenile, it does have a little bit of benefit here to remind you that it's the same on both sides. And the same applies for muscles. Muscles are the same on both sides. Okay. So we have 206 bones in the body. 22 of them are in the skull alone. Then we have another 30 or so different types of openings in the skull that to master. So a little bit every day, chipping away at it, chipping away at it, chipping away at it every day is a good way to learn this and retain it. Yeah. What's the best way to learn something like this? Well, lots of people make flashcards. Yeah, if you make your own flashcards, you're reinforcing it when you write it down. You're reinforcing it when you write down the question, write down the answer, put the picture on the flashcard with the answer behind it. That reinforces in a couple different areas. Quiz yourself, have somebody else quiz you, teach it to somebody else. If you can work together with somebody, that's even better. That's a real good approach too, to prepare for this. Any way that you can reinforce the learning, the storing of the information in your memory, because we have multiple memory centers in our brain, and we want to store it in all those, so that you can draw it in from written word and spoken word and pictures, and teaching is different than just speaking it out loud. So there's lots of ways to memorize this. So of the skull, all these bones in the skull come together. It is a very complicated structure. We have a model in the lab in Sevierville that is called the exploded skull. And it's not put together, because every time you put it together, it falls apart. But that's a whole other story. The fact that the skull pieces really do fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. The model doesn't hold together like it should, but they do fit together like a big puzzle. So anyway, let's move on. This is a scan of the skull. It shows you how the skull sits on top of the spinal column. You can see the spinal column right here with all the vertebrae. You can see all the way down past the cervical vertebrae into the start of the thoracic vertebrae. You can see various bones of the skull. You can see different lines in the skull. There's also this funny dark spot on the side there that I've often wondered about too. Never had any explanation on what it is. But you can see, you can also see the ribs down here, and you see the collarbone, the clavicles projecting off of the sternum. The sternum is this bone here in the middle. And you can see parts of the shoulder blade, the scapula, on either side here. And when it goes around, you can see part of it there in that image too. So anyway, it's a good illustration here, real-time illustration showing you how these all fit together. Number one bone that nobody ever gets wrong in the bone test, and I always do put it on the bone test, is the frontal bone. Frontal bone sits in the front of the skull. It forms our forehead. It forms the shape of our face. It goes from the midline of the skull to halfway down the eye orbits. That's the structure that contains the eyeballs. It goes down to the top of the nasal cavity. It is a very thick bone. You can feel it if you rub your forehead. The skin on top of it is very, very thin. And there's a muscle on top of this bone. To give you the example I was telling you earlier, the muscle on top of the bone is called the frontalis. So you have the frontal bone with the frontalis, and underneath that, inside the skull, you've got the frontal lobe. So you got three different structures that share the same name. The frontal bone is in the front of the skull. It's a large bone. Nobody ever gets that wrong. on the bone test. And all these bones, the bones of the cranium, are designed to protect the skull. Designed to protect the skull. So here's our model of the skull. If we were in class, we would have these out for everybody. And I'm still going to make them available to everybody starting next week to go in and look at in the lab, so that you can actually, if you want to play with these and compare them to the video or the PowerPoint, you can. These are life size, and they're probably all male skulls. There isn't much difference between a male and a female skull. The shape of the cheekbone is probably the biggest difference in the male skull versus the female skull. The male skull cheekbone's a little thicker, and the male skull tends to have a little bump in the back. So I don't purchase the supplies. I don't know where we get our plastic. These are all plastic. They feel real, but they're plastic. Where we get them and why it's so hard to get male and female parts. It took for us years. I'll tell you, it took us years to acquire on the Cerrillo campus a female pelvis skeletal model. I don't know why, but it did. It's hard. They were hard to find and hard to get. We finally got one now. So, because there are significant differences, and I'll show you that in the appendicular skeleton. There are significant differences in the pelvic structure of a male and a female. Okay, moving on. This big round thing is the orbit, the eye orbit. There's one on each side because we have two eyes. And so this is the eye orbit, and the eyeball goes inside there. And within the orbit, there are a number of openings on each side, plus you can see the outline of various bones. Now, in reality, our bones are not outlined like that. So now something else here. So this is called the eye orbit. Now there's a notch up here and a hole down here. Now the notch is called the supraorbital notch. Supra is a prefix. It means superior or above. So the supraorbital notch is a notch in the bone above the orbit. Sounds sort of simplistic, but that's how it is. It's the notch above the orbit. If you have the term superior or supra anywhere, you're going to have an inferior or an infra to go along with it. The way anatomy is organized is if you have a term like superior, you're going to have an inferior. If you have an internal, you're going to have an external. If you have a medial, you're usually going to have a lateral. You have an anterior, you're likely going to have a posterior. And so what we have, if we have a supraorbital notch, we have an infraorbital foramen. First of all, foramen means opening. I guess it's Latin for opening or hole or something, but it means opening. Infraorbital means the opening below the orbit. Now you're going to see these terms supra and infra many times now. You know, we have a flat area on our shoulder blade called the supraspinous fossa. I don't want to jump the gun. Fossa means flat area. Supraspinous means above the spine. Infraspinous means below the spine. So the term supra and infra, more than just the location of these notches and orbits, these foramens, are these terms, supra and infra, superior and inferior, derived from that. Means above and below. In this case, above the orbit, below the orbit. And again, a foramen is an opening. Here we see the optic foramen. And what goes through the optic foramen? The optic nerve. Comes out of the back of the eyeball and goes through that opening into the brain. Because the brain's on the other side of that bony wall there. That is the optic foramen. Directly in front of the optic foramen is a bone on in both orbits on the medial wall of the orbit, because it's on this side of the wall of the orbit closest to the midline, is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is not a little bone. It extends from side to side in the orbit, one in each orbit on the medial surface. It also extends all the way down to the base of the nasal cavity and extends up into the cranial cavity. So it forms part of the floor of the cranial cavity, and it forms part of the floor of the nasal cavity. So it's sort of an irregular shaped bone, fairly large, not the largest that we see in here, but it is a fairly large bone. There's our frontal bone, right there in the front of the skull. And we know that, if you can feel that bone, you know the muscle underneath there is pretty thin, and our skin layer is pretty thin too. Well, the muscle, the frontalis muscle, is pretty much only used for expression. How do we feel about things? Or as our psychology colleagues would say, how does that make you feel? No. Anyway, there's the frontal bone. Directly behind the frontal bone on both sides of the skull are the parietal bones. The parietal bones are paired. They form, the frontal bone extends back to about halfway back to the midline of the skull, and the parietal bones form at the midline, and they're paired, and they run back about halfway back halfway towards the base of the skull. You'll get better pictures of them. Just like the frontal bone has the frontal lobes underneath it, we have the parietal lobe underneath the parietal bone. So we have two frontal lobes, one on each side. We have two parietal lobes in the brain. Here we have another irregular shaped bone. It doesn't look like much right here. It's called the sphenoid bone, except the sphenoid bone extends from the right side to the left side of the skull. It forms again, the base of the cranial cavity. It supports the pituitary gland. It protects the underside of the brain. It has two structures that look like wings, and the overall description of the sphenoid bone is shaped like a bat or a bat wing. Or even if you look at that part of it, it looks like the Batman symbol. So you'll see that when we get inside here. So it extends all the way across internally. Below the sphenoid, we have the temporal bone. The temporal bone is the bone that surrounds your external ear. The ear canal that goes in through your skull on the side goes through the temporal bone. We have one on each side. And conveniently, underneath the temporal bone are the temporal lobes, either side of our brain. Now, this bone here is often called our cheekbone, but it's actually our zygomatic bone. It makes up the bottom outside quarter of our eye orbit. The size and shape of the zygomatic bone is often dictated by the sex chromosomes. The male orbits tend to be larger and bulkier and more squared off or rectangular in shape than do female orbits. So we see a boxy shaped orbit or a more of a rounded orbit with more elevated zygomatic bones. It just depends. It's not necessarily a good indicator, of determining the sex of a skeleton that way. There's much better procedures for determining the sex of the skeleton, like the size of the pelvic girdle, for example. Anyway, that's the zygomatic bone. The maxilla is our upper jaw. The maxilla doesn't move. It contains 16 teeth, which correspond to the 16 teeth in the lower jaw. The mandible, which is this bone, the mandible is our lower jaw, and the mandible articulates. Now that means when bones move against each other, when bones move, they articulate. The mandible will articulate against the bones of the skull here at the back, but the teeth we brought together for chewing. We have 2 or 3 sets of muscles, about three sets of skeletal muscle that attach to the skull and to the mandible that pull the mandible up when we chew. So while the maxilla doesn't do anything, we use the teeth of the maxilla as the work surface for the teeth that are moving up and down on the mandible. We grind against the teeth in the maxilla. We rip and tear against the teeth in the maxilla, and we slice and cut. Because our teeth are designed to do 3 different things. They rip and tear, slice and cut, and crush and grind. And so while we're not moving the teeth of the upper jaw, we're moving the teeth of the lower jaw, and they work together. So there's the mandible, and the mandible moves. I'll show you when we get into muscles. 3 distinct sets of muscles control the movement of the mandible. Now this area in the middle here is called the mandibular symphysis, right in the middle. Don't ignore that other green arrow. The mandibular symphysis is in the middle. The symphysis area is usually where 2 bones have grown together and form one. It's like a junction of 2 bones. When we are in utero and we're developing, now bear in mind that our skeleton has been laid down in utero 6 weeks after conception. So 6 weeks after we were a 1-celled organism, and we stayed 1 cell for about 36 hours. By the time we implanted, we're well over 160 cells, and we are very well organized. At the end of 7 days, we're implanted in the uterus with an inner cell mass, an outer cell mass, and a coelom, a cavity in the cell mass, and we are very organized. 2 weeks later, we have a heart, and it's beating. 3 weeks after that, we have a complete skeleton in place, and we're about 1 inch long. We've gone from something the size of the head of a pin to something that 6 weeks later is 1 inch long and has all of its hands and feet and fingers and toes and head and internal organs. And our skeleton for the first 6 weeks is made of cartilage. The first 6 weeks from conception to 6 weeks out, our skeleton as it forms is made of hyaline cartilage. And the bones of the top of the skull, frontal, parietal, temporal, and so on, are made out of membrane. These bones will gradually calcify, or if we say ossify, these cartilage bones will gradually turn into real bone over the next 20 years. Most of our bones are in place when we're born. Lots of soft spots in the skull, still a lot of hyaline cartilage in our long bones. We don't have a complete finished skeleton until we're about 23 years old. Anyway, back to the mandibular symphysis. When we look in utero, we can see that our lower jaw was formed from 2 mandible structures that grew together into one. And the junction is called the mandibular symphysis. The symphysis is where 2 bones come together. Well, there's no gap in the middle. But there is another symphysis in the body where there is a gap filled with cartilage. And that is the pubic symphysis, where the 2 pubic bones in the pelvis come together with a big pad of cartilage in the middle. It functions as a shock absorber when we walk. more about that when we get into the appendicular skeleton. Mandibular angle, the mandible comes over and then shoots upward so it can articulate in a special flat area at the base of the, on the outside base of the skull. And that the shaft going up then is called the mandibular ramus. Okay, interesting structure here. That pointy thing is called a styloid process. It's found on the temporal bone. Temporal bone, of course, is the bone on the side where the ears are located. You can see without the ears, you can see the opening of the ear canal right here. This is actually called the external auditory meatus. That's the opening for the auditory nerve to go into the brain. And that pointy thing there is called a styloid process. Old term, old Latin term. A stylus is a writing stick. You know, early anatomists used, early writers used tablets made of clay, and they wrote symbols in the clay with a sharp stick, and then they left a permanent record of that. Later, they went to parchment and whatever, and eventually paper. But the writing stick was always called, was the name for the writing stick was a stylus. And you know, any sharp object, a sharp stick, became a stylus. Now, move forward a couple thousand years, and what are we using now to mark on our tablets and our computers, and our notebooks? A stylus. So nothing new under the sun, as they say. We still revert back to you know, if technology works, it works regardless of how we're using it. The point is that these sharp structures are called the styloid process. Early anatomists compared it to a sharp writing stick. Now, why do we care about it? Because they show these styloid processes show up in 3 different locations. They're in the base of the skull, and they are in the bones of the forearm on both the ulna and the radius on each arm, and they are points of attachment for muscles. You know, they're very unique structures. Styloid process. You know, the name has lasted for, I guess, 1,000 years. Whenever, a couple thousand years, who knows? Whenever early anatomists discovered that pointy structure, and styluses have been used for writing. So the next time you write something, think of the styloid process. Okay, going back to our model, of course, you can see the styloid process right here. This is a remnant. This, where the arrow is now, is a remnant of the membranes that form the top of the skull. Most of the skeleton in our body was formed from cartilage, using cartilage as the model. Cartilage was the frame, and we just calcified it and made it rigid. And it took, as I said, took about 20 years to get there, because we don't have a complete skeleton in place till we're about 23 years old. Now, those membranes grew together, and as they grew together and finally calcified, they left a joint here. This joint is called an immobile joint. And it's the common name for one of these joints is a suture. This is known as the coronal suture. Remember, coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. Well, there's our coronal suture dividing the skull into the anterior portion and the posterior portion. So in this area, this is the coronal suture separates the parietal bone on either side from the frontal bone. 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones. There's the frontal bone. There's the parietal bone. Sutures are joints that don't move anymore. Yeah. The knee is a joint. The elbow is a joint. They move freely, sometimes too freely. The suture lines are joints that are interwoven and no longer move. There's our temporal bone. We have a joint between the parietal and the temporal. We have a joint between the parietal and this bone down here called the occipital. There's our zygomatic bone. There we go. This new bone is the occipital bone. The occipital bone is a very large bone forming the base, the external base of the skull. It goes from about halfway back here all the way around to the base of the maxilla on the inside. It protects the very bottom of the brain. It also has a very large opening in it to allow the passage of the spinal cord to go up and connect with the brainstem. And so there's this, it's also, so there's a very large opening there for the spinal cord to come up to the brainstem. There's also two large bumps on either side of this opening to allow the skull to set on top of the spinal column. So the occipital lobe does a lot for us. And on top of that, it protects the occipital lobe of the brain. You know, so remember, all these bones share the same name as the brain lobe underneath it. The occipital lobe is our vision lobe. The occipital lobe is where we see. The eyeballs only collect light rays and stimulate our retinas when we send nerve impulses into the brain. Where we actually comprehend what we're seeing and understand what we're seeing and recall other images takes place in the back of the brain, in the occipital region. And so we have this very strong bone protecting that area called the occipital bone. There is a suture line separating the parietal bone and temporal bone, and there's another suture line separating the parietal and the occipital. That's called the lambdoid suture. So we have the coronal suture, the squamous suture, and the lambdoid suture. There's one more you'll see, it's called the sagittal suture, and that runs right down the middle. Remember, a sagittal plane gives you a left and right side. The sagittal suture runs right down the middle of the skull and gives you a left and right parietal bone. Okay. Nasal bone. Only half of the nose is taken up by the nasal bone. The other half is still cartilage. The bottom portion of our nose is very flexible, sometimes too flexible. The nasal bone starts about halfway up on your nose, where you can stop bending your nose is where the nasal bone starts. Now this bone here is one we can feel. This is called the mastoid process. If you put your fingers behind your ears, about the middle area behind your ear, you can feel a large bump on each side. That's the mastoid process. That does two things for us. It is an alternate pathway for sound waves to get to the inner ear, because the bone here is very spongy and hollow. So pressure waves from sound can pass through there very easily. The mastoid processing on either side is often used for cochlear implants for people with hearing impairments, so we can get to the inner ear. The other thing that the mastoid process does is that the muscles that control the movement of turning the head left and right and up and down attach to the skull at the mastoid process. So they attach at the mastoid process, and they can pull on the mastoid process in the direct, so the head will turn in the direction we want it to go. We want to go to the right, we pull on the right mastoid. We want to go to the left, we turn on the left mastoid. Our head turns left or right. So the mastoid process is a pretty fascinating little structure. We can feel it very easily. We've often done a demonstration in lab with tuning forks, where you can take tuning forks and strike it and have it play its note, and hold the base of the fork against the mastoid process, and you can hear the sound coming through your bone from the tuning fork. The mastoid process transmits that sound for you. Okay. there's the styloid process right there. There is the ethmoid bone again on the inside surface of our, on the medial surface of our orbit. And this little bone right here is called the lacrimal bone. And a lacrimal bone gives rise to it. There's an opening there right here for the lacrimal gland. The lacrimal gland releases tears that wash across the front of our eyeball to keep the eyeball clean. Dust, dirt, debris, pathogens, whatever, are washed away every time we blink. So we are constantly bathing the front of the anterior surface of our eyeball with lacrimal fluid. Now here's an opening in the mandible. We know that openings are usually called foramens. Now, and based on what you've learned already, you'd probably say that's the mandibular or mandible foramen. Well, it's perfectly logical to say that. It's wrong, but it's perfectly logical. You might just lead me down the wrong path there. This is not the mandibular foramen. There is a mandibular foramen, but this is called the mental foramen. That area of the mandible is called the mental area. I have no idea why. I've never been able to find out why we call it the mental foramen. The mandibular foramens are present, and the mental foramens are on both sides, by the way. Mandibular foramens, there are two of them on the inside surface of the mandible. And anytime you have a foramen, it's nearly always for a passage for blood vessels and nerves, or nerves alone. One or the other, or both. Now there's our occipital bone, just to give you some perspective on just how big it is, how large it is. It extends from about halfway down the back, the posterior region of the skull, and it extends all the way up to just at the where this flat area ends here. Your maxilla is going to start next. It's not connected to the maxilla, but the maxilla stops or starts, however your perspective is, right where that flat area is. So it's a very large bone, and the opening, you can see the opening here. This is the opening that we're seeing as it goes around, that large opening there. That's called the foramen magnum. That's the passage for the spinal cord going up into the brain, connecting with the brainstem. Where the brainstem ends and the spinal cord begins is problematic because it's a little bit funny. It just sort of all runs together in there. There's the occipital bone. Three things it does. It gives shape to the back of the skull. Male skulls tend to have more of a bump back here than female skull does. Don't know why. Maybe muscle attachment. I mean, that little ridge there is a point of muscle attachment. So it protects the occipital lobe and the foramen magnum, which means really big hole or a large opening, is in the middle of the occipital bone. Now this is your mandible, and here are your mandibular foramens, one on each side. They're internal. They're on the internal side of the mandible. See, remember, bone is living tissue. Well, not these, but in our bodies, bone is living tissue. There are living bone cells embedded in the hard matrix, the calcified matrix. The living bone cells are inside that matrix, and they need to be supplied with oxygen and glucose, and they need to have waste products removed and CO2 taken away. They have to be responsive to stimulus. So they have to communicate to every other bone cell around them, even though they're trapped in the matrix and they can't move. They're communicating to everybody else, and they have to be fed and constantly. And so we have all these foramen with blood vessels and nerves going through there so that we can communicate to every bone cell. because they are not, bones are not dead tissue. About 60% of the bone mass is calcium salts, but the other 40% are going to be the living bone cells. This bone is very, very responsive to stress and pain and to twisting, and it adapts. It will grow in response to stresses. It will weaken in response to lack of stress. So anyway, I just sort of digressed on that one. Okay, sutures, suture line. The term for a suture is a fibrous joint. We'll get into that when we talk about joints and articulations. This is the only place we have sutures are going to be in the skull. We have there. This shows you your sagittal suture, dividing along the sagittal plane, giving you a left and right side of the skull, with your two parietal bones, one on either side, showing up. And then the coronal suture separates the two parietals from the frontal bone. There is no frontal suture in the adult skull that extends through here. You will see it on the fetal skull, but it goes away as the membranes grow together. Sutures of the skull. Again, even better look than that illustration did. We see there's the frontal bone, the two parietal bones there, the occipital bone. We have the coronal suture separating the frontal bone from the two parietals. We have the sagittal suture separating the left and right parietals. And we have the lambdoid suture, lambdoid. I wanted to say lamboid, but it's lambdoid suture separating the parietals from the occipital. And then we have the suture line, the sphenoidal suture separating the parietal from the temporal on the sides. Okay. So let's take a look inside now. We looked at just about everything we can see, excuse me, on the outside. Let's take a look internally, the internal workings of the skull. Sphenoid bone, large bone, extends from side to side. We see this out the external surface of the sphenoid just behind the zygomatic, just in front of the temporal and slightly below the parietal and the frontal. It extends, the sphenoid bone extends all the way across the base of the cranial cavity. It extends down to right behind the maxilla. Sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone have two important roles played. They look like, externally they look like the little bones, but they're not. The sphenoid bone forms the underside of the cranial cavity. It extends from side to side. And this whole blue thing here, not out here, but this thing is the sphenoid bone. This area here is called the sella turcica. That is the home of the pituitary gland, the master gland of our bodies, located right here. We see several openings here. An opening for the optic nerve. There are other nerve passageways here, and it's shaped somewhat like a bat. The wings are shaped here. And if you look at it carefully, when we look inside the skull, you can see that the upper wing looks very much like the Batman logo, but the whole bone is shaped like a bat. If you ever watched a bat fly, the way the wings bend, well, that's what the sphenoid bone looks like. This little bone up here is the ethmoid. The ethmoid bone serves as a passageway for olfactory nerves. The olfactory nerves, the receptors for the olfactory nerves are for our sense of smell. The receptors are located in the upper region of the nasal cavity. the inside lining of the nasal cavity, the superior surface, is lined with olfactory receptors. And the nerve branches from those receptors lead into the skull to the brain, and they go through little perforations in the ethmoid bone directly up into the brain to reach what's known as the olfactory bulb. And then the olfactory bulb leads those nerve impulses that come up into the brain, and we can interpret what we're smelling. Okay. So looking inside our skull, we can see our sphenoid bone. This is the sphenoid bone right here. This whole big structure is the sphenoid bone, shaped like a bat. The illustration does a better job because of the bat wings. This portion up here is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Definitely looks, it gives you, it sort of reminds you of the Batman symbol or Batman logo. But the whole structure does look like a bat if you look at it carefully. We have, if we have a lesser anything, we've got to have a greater. And the greater is this, the greater wing of the sphenoid. In anatomy, the way structures are described, we have lessers and greaters. If we have lesser, we have greater. If we have superior, we have inferior. If we have external, we have internal. Lesser and greater. So anyway. So in the lesser wing of the sphenoid and the greater wing of the sphenoid, we have openings for various nerves along here and up here. I'll get to those in a minute. This structure here at 63 is the sella turcica. It is sella turcica is Latin, meaning Turk's saddle, because the shape of the bone here with its little groove in the middle where the pituitary gland resides. So the pituitary gland is about the size of a pea, size and shape of a pea sitting in there, and it is greatly protected by this saddle-shaped structure. Early anatomists described it as the Turk's saddle. Perhaps they were alluding to a different type of saddle. So important point there. Now, down here, there's the jugular foramen. There are two of them, one on either side. The jugular foramen is the passageway for the jugular vein on its return trip back down from the brain going to the heart. Veins always drain to the heart in the human body. Veins will always drain to the heart. And so the jugular veins are coming down from the skull, from the top of the brain, down through the foramens into the thoracic cavity and back into the great vessels that lead into the heart. One on each side. This opening is the other jugular foramens over here. This is the foramen magnum. It's about the size of your thumb. When we have the skull models, to give you perspective here, you can easily stick your thumb through that opening. Okay. So it's a very large opening to allow the passage of the spinal cord to come up into the brain, or the brain stem to come down to the spinal cord, one or the other. Anyway, foramen magnum. There's the sella turcica. Again, the location of the pituitary gland. The master gland of the body controls the release of 8 different hormones for us. We also have 4 openings here. Those 4 openings are the passageway for 4 cranial nerves. Now, it's easy to remember their names because the 2 outside openings are called the foramen ovale. Remember, just about every opening is called the foramen. I've seen it written ovale foramen as opposed to foramen ovale. Doesn't matter. The 2 inner openings are called the foramen lacerum. So an easy way to remember this is ovale is on the outside of these. The two outside ones are the ovales, the two insides are the lacerums. Figure if you can remember ovale, then you ought to be able to remember lacerum. Ovale, lacerum, lacerum, ovale. Those are the openings for 4 cranial nerves that go into and out of the brain. And since the openings are named the same, it's likely that the nerves are the same nerves on both sides, different branches, just branches of the same nerve going into or out of the brain. Another perspective of our skull. Again, we can see the sella turcica right here. This gives you a better idea of the size of the sella turcica and the ridge line that you see here. We see the foramen magnum. We see the jugular foramen here and over here. Now this little opening, there's the jugular foramen. This little opening here, tiny opening called the hypoglossal canal. Very, very important to us. Hypoglossal canal is the passageway for the hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal nerve comes down from the medulla oblongata in the brainstem. The medulla is a big reflex center. We're going to talk about that in lecture when we get into the brain. But the medulla is a big reflex center. It controls our ability to swallow. It controls the movement of our tongue. Swallowing is a reflex. The medulla controls that. The medulla also helps to control the movement of our tongue when we eat and when we talk. And it controls the tongue through the hypoglossal nerve that comes down through the hypoglossal canal. If that nerve gets blocked or damaged, or if the medulla is damaged in the region where it controls swallowing or speaking or chewing, then your patient often has difficulty. A lot of times a patient with damage to the medulla will exhibit those symptoms when they start aspirating fluids or aspirating food. They can't eat, they can't swallow properly. They start choking on their food because there is damage to the medulla. And the signal going down the hypoglossal nerve to the tongue isn't working. Again, swallowing is a reflex. It should be automatic. But many patients with damage to the medulla, that's one of those things that's really, really subtle to notice. A good indicator that something might be up is every time they try to swallow, they aspirate, they choke on it. So it might be an indicator something went on, because that kind of damage is very hard to pick up on, particularly if you're dealing with dementia patients, because dementia patients can't communicate well. Because in the stages where, by the time you're in your 8th or 9th year of dementia, your communication skills are very poor. So anyway, hypoglossal canal on either side of the foramen magnum. Now this is a perspective. This is the same view we had earlier here, when we're looking down on the sella turcica, except now, there's the sella turcica. But now we've taken the skull and we've tilted it down at a 45-degree angle. So what we're looking at now is there's the sella turcica right there. There's the back wall of the sella turcica right there. But we've tilted this at a 45-degree angle, so we expose 2 openings that we didn't see before. You'll notice that the 4 openings, the ovale, lacerum, ovale, are not visible. They're hidden now behind this bony structure right here. They're just on the other side of this bony wall, but they're not visible. There's the sella turcica right there. So we know that we're still looking at the sphenoid bone. But what we're seeing in this picture is now we've exposed the optic foramen from the other side. Because then the optic foramen extends from the orbit into the brain. If you were to take a probe in the eye orbit, you could push that probe through the optic foramen from the eyeball side into the brain, right here, come out right here, and over here. There's the other optic foramen there. This fissure that you see right here and here is the same fissure, large fissure that you saw when you looked into the orbit, you know, and then very first slide, and where you saw the optic foramen from the front side. Now this is another opening for another nerve. This is the foramen rotundum, you know, one on each side. It's not visible when you're looking straight down. You have to tilt the skull 45 degrees down at a 45-degree angle so that these various structures show up. It also allows us, you know, gives us a better perspective on the hypoglossal canal down here and the jugular foramen here, but it also highlights two other structures that we want to see. This opening here and here, there and there, are the internal auditory meatus. This is where the auditory nerve exits the bone so it can go into the brain and tell us what we're hearing. It starts at the external acoustic meatus or auditory meatus in the temporal bone on the outside of the brain, outside of the skull. It extends all the way through this ridge of bone here and then pops out right here so it can go up into the auditory regions of the brain. In fact, this ridge of bone that we see here and here are called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This ridge line is easily visible here and here. And there's the internal auditory or internal acoustic meatus. Yeah. On either side, directly above the jugular foramen. So let me go back here. I want to just show you this. See, we can see it fairly well here. The skull is not tilted completely yet, but you can see there's the optic foramen there and there. There's a better image of the sella turcica. You can see the shape of the saddle. There is the foramen rotundum there and there. And here, at least you can see the two foramen ovales here and here. There is the petrous portion of the temporal bone here and here. The external auditory meatus is out here and out here. And here is the internal auditory or acoustic meatus. The auditory nerve travels through this bone, this ridge of bone here and here, so that it can come up into the brain. So, okay, moving on. Mentioned this earlier, the olfactory bulb are two structures. They're on either side of the brain. They are usually on the base of the frontal lobes. They're almost directly on top of a bone called the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate is the bone that's perforated. It is part of the ethmoid bone that is perforated and allows the olfactory nerves to come up to the olfactory bulbs. There's an area on the inside of the nasal cavity, on the internal superior surface of the nasal cavity is lined with olfactory epithelial cells designed to detect odors. And they send their nerve impulses through the olfactory nerve branches, through the cribriform plate, through all these little holes that you can see in here, these little tiny perforations. And it comes up and communicates to the olfactory bulbs, which send signals into the brain and say, hey, this is what we're smelling. The brain tells us, you know, receptors don't do anything. No receptor, no sense receptor can tell you what you're tasting, smelling, seeing, hearing, feeling, or touching. It can only be stimulated. and generate a nerve impulse. The brain has to tell us everything. We don't feel or smell or taste or see anything except in the brain. And so the idea is to get the nerve impulses into the brain so the brain can process it and tell us what it is. Now, above the cribriform plate is a projection called the crista galli. Crista galli is also part of the ethmoid bone. It's in the front above the crista galli. This is point of attachment for what are called the meninges. Our brain is so squishy. If you were to take the brain out of the skull and set it out on an examining tray, it would collapse. It is so soft. It can't support its own weight. The only way the brain maintains its structure is to float, and it floats inside a sac of this connective tissue. That sac is made up of the meninges, and the brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid inside the meninge sac. The meninges are 3 layers here. The outermost layer, you may have heard it called the dura mater or the dura mater. And the meninges attach themselves, they anchor themselves to the crista galli so the brain doesn't move around inside the skull. Because the brain's very squishy and the brain will move. Blunt force trauma on one side of the skull will cause the brain to slam across to the other side. And while you can have trauma on one side from a direct blow, you can have even greater trauma on the other side of the brain from bouncing against the inside of the skull on the opposite side of the trauma. Because the brain will move side to side, front and back. It's squishy. And to help protect against a lot of that, the brain is anchored in the meninges, which are anchored to the crista galli inside the cranial cavity itself. So try to minimize the amount of movement of the brain. And here we see, there's the crista galli at that's the very tip of the ethmoid bone right there at 58. 59, all these structures here, that is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. This is still the ethmoid bone. And if you look very carefully, you can almost imagine the perforations there where the olfactory nerves, the branches of the olfactory nerve are coming up. We get in contact with the olfactory bulbs. So that's how we direct the passage of the olfactory nerves, because you've got lots and lots, you got thousands of olfactory receptors embedded in the upper surface of our nasal cavity. And each one of those has to report on what it's detecting. Now, if we quickly look at the underside of our skull, we can see obviously the foramen magnum right here. Again, foramen magnum is about as big as your thumb. Bigger, you can stick your thumb through it very easily. Now here's the jugular foramen here and here. Directly in front of that, on either side, is the carotid canal. The carotid artery, very large artery that comes up off the aorta, largest blood vessel in the body, coming directly off the heart. There are 2 branches of the carotid artery coming up off of the aorta, and they split and go internal and external, and they will pass through the carotid canal. Carotid canal is the passageway to go up to the brain. It's right next to the jugular foramen for blood coming away from the brain. In AP2, we'll talk about this. There are very few places in the body where arteries and veins have different names. Nearly always, arteries and veins are going to have, the artery and the vein, have the same, they share the same name. Like the artery to the spleen is called the splenic artery. The artery coming back, the vein coming back from the spleen is the splenic vein, something like that. The renal artery and the renal vein, they share the name. Carotid artery and jugular vein are running in opposite directions. The carotid artery is taking blood to the brain. It's a large artery doing that. The jugular veins are the large veins bringing blood back. They should share the same name. They don't. So anyway, carotid canal and jugular foramen side by side. New term. You'll hear more of it when we get into the appendicular skeleton, but this is the mandibular fossa. Fossa means flat area. In this case, the mandibular fossa is where the top of the mandible articulates with the skull. The two bones come together. So the mandibular fossa is a flat area. A fossa is always a flat area. This bone here, dividing the posterior region of the nasal cavity, is the vomer. The nasal cavity starts here and goes forward, or starts forward and ends here. But this divides the nasal cavity in half. Now, part of that reason is because we want to generate turbulence in the nasal cavity. Air comes into the nasal cavity. We divide it up with the vomer, and we also have three large protrusions in the nasal cavity called conchae, and we create turbulence as the air moves in. This allows the air to come in contact with all the mucus in our nasal cavity, which does two things. It allows us to deposit dust, dirt, debris, and pathogens and crud in that mucus. It also allows the air to be moistened from the mucus. And by moving around inside this nasal cavity, it allows the air to be warmed up. So the air that goes into our airway is cleaner and warmer and moister than it was when it came in. We like that. We like clean, warm, and moist air. That's the vomer. In front of the vomer is the palatine bone. And this is going to be leading to the heart. It's going to be forming part of the hard palate, the roof of the mouth, if you will. There's the palatine bone right there. It's also the bone that separates the nasal cavity from the part of the bone that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And here we see the rest of it. This is the palatine process of the maxilla. As you know, here is the palatine bone right here. The roof of our mouth is made up of the palatine bone and the palatine process of the maxilla, the hard palate. So, and the barrier between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. Of course, there's our vomer again right there. And there's our styloid process again. There's our mastoid process. Another foramen, stylomastoid foramen, right there. These are the occipital condyles. A condyle is a bump, a process, a raised area that has an inferior superior direction, up and down, if you will. Condyles go up and down. When we get into the arms and legs, we'll see structures known as epicondyles. They go side to side. Condyles are processes that have a superior and inferior position. Epicondyles have a medial lateral shape. And there's that stylomastoid foramen right there at the base of the styloid process. In the front of the nasal cavity, we have the last part of the ethmoid bone. We divide the nasal cavity in the front with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. In the back, it's divided in the posterior region of the nasal cavity by the vomer. The labella is all that's left of the frontal suture, because the frontal bones grew together from membranes. They grew together from membranes, and there was a frontal suture which disappeared as the membrane fused into one, And all that we have left is the labella, this little series of ridges right here above the nasal bone. There is, just to show you the counterpart, there is the external auditory or acoustic meads. And their names go back and forth on here. That's where the ear is. That's the opening for where the passage of the auditory nerve that goes into the brain. Now, almost done. Fetal skull. Again, it's a model, life-size model. Here we can see the frontal suture, which doesn't exist in us, in adults. Frontal suture closes when the two frontal bones that you see here, the two frontal bones grow together into one bone. We don't have two frontal bones. We have one frontal bone. They came from a membrane, and that membrane grew together. You know, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital bones all grew together from membranes. And the frontal bone started out as two separate membranes, grew into one. We had a suture line that disappeared. All that's left of that suture line is the labella. We have one bone, the frontal bone. They're the frontal bones at that point. Now, back here, this is the anterior fontanelle. The anterior fontanelle is what we call the soft spot. It's made of connective tissue. It allows the skull to have flexibility as the brain grows, you know, during development and after we're born, you know, until we reach our adult stature. Again, it takes us about 20 some years until we're done growing our bones. And anterior fontanelle, and every time you have an anterior anything, you're going to have a posterior. Yeah, pectoralis major, totally unrelated to anterior and posterior. Pectoralis major, I was trying to think of this earlier. If you have a major structure, you'll have a minor structure. If you have an anterior structure, you'll have a posterior structure. So if there's an anterior fontanelle, we will have a posterior fontanelle. This is a soft spot, a squishy area that allows the skull to have a little bit of give during childbirth, but also to allow the brain to enlarge. Parietal bones back here. Another perspective here is our parietal bone, one on each side, frontal bone. Here is our coronal suture. You don't see the frontal suture and you don't see the sagittal suture from this perspective. Temporal bone, frontal suture. This is one of the fontanelles, one of the soft spots. This is the sphenoidal fontanelle. There's another one back here. This is called the mastoid fontanelle. So we have a sphenoidal fontanelle and a mastoid fontanelle on either side. We have the anterior fontanelle up here. We have the frontal suture, which disappears. We have the coronal suture, which remains. We have the sagittal suture, which remains. We look at the posterior region of the skull. We can see the sagittal suture right there. The two parietal bones, one on either side. The lambdoid suture. And right here, in all its glory, is the posterior fontanelle. So these these six fontanelles give us all the flexibility we need as our brain is getting bigger and bigger as we grow. Gives us that flexibility. It takes a long time for the bones of the skull to finally fuse. Okay. And that is the skull. So here, I'm giving you a lot to look at. Took longer than I thought to go through today, but it was information that you're going to need. Anyone have any questions on this? Or did I just overwhelm you to the point that you want to run screaming out of the building? So, okay, I got you. Yeah. I try not to take myself too serious when I do this because I understand how much I'm throwing at you. But again, if you have, you're going to have a lot of time to get ready for this. Just a little bit every day is the best way to prepare. So, any questions? Okay. If not, I'm going to get us out of here. And I'll say, I hope you have a good weekend, despite the fact I've loaded you up with stuff. So, anyway, see you next week.